Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Cover to Cover. My name is Beth and I'm your co-host for today.
Hi, my name is Naomi. I'm also a copy editor. What are we going to talk about today, Beth?
Well, the weather's been getting quite chilly here in Seoul lately.
Actually, I'm pulling out my cardigan these days, as you can see. Did you know that fall here in Korea is popularly known as the reading season?
I did not. There's a phrase for that actually, right?
Yeah, I actually just learned this the other day. It's called 사색의 계절, which means it's the season of contemplation or reflection or deep reflection.
Right. And what better way to reflect that than by reading a good book, right?
So in line with the season, we have each brought a book that has been a bestseller in Korea. My pick for this month is Baek Se-hee's I Want to Die, but I Want to Eat 떡볶이. 죽고 싶지만 떡볶이 먹고 싶어. That was translated by Anton Her. The English translation came out in summer, but the original was first published in 2018.
That's right. And my pick actually is a work that has not yet been translated into English. It's called 불편한 편의점, right here, or Inconvenient Convenience Store by Kim Ho-yeon, which came out in April 2021.
That's really interesting. I've heard about that book.
Yeah, that's right. It's been really hot and all over the blogs and YouTube these days with reviews. But first, let's dive right into your book. Can you introduce it for us, Naomi?
Yeah, so before I dive in, I do want to flag a disclaimer. This book does talk about mental health issues, tackling depression and anxiety. So please stop here if any of these topics may be potentially triggering to you. I Want to Die, but I Want to Eat 떡볶이 is a part memoir, part self-help book. The author, Baek Se-hee, received psychiatric treatment for dysthymia, or persistent mild depression, for 10 years. So she started writing about these sessions for her essays before writing this book and its sequel. So in this book, it's a record of the dialogue she has with her psychiatrist in her therapy sessions over a 12-week period. And it also includes 17 mini essays, which she calls reflections on life following therapy.
Why did you pick this book in particular?
So I think what stands out for me is that I don't think I've read anything quite like it before. As someone who's gone to therapy myself, I was also, partly very curious about what other people's therapy sessions looked like, and it is a very fascinating read. So it's essentially a transcript of the conversations she has with her therapist. And so the dialogue format, like a back and forth dialogue format, makes it really easy to read and follow. And it also has a page or two before and after the transcript. That's the author's musings about the topic or a certain theme. So some parts are very helpful and very easy to relate to because it deals with, the most inner and private thoughts that any individual can have, just dealing with life in general. Feelings of loneliness, wanting to be loved, the fear of being judged. And you'll read how her psychiatrist helps her work through those feelings and thoughts and see the author come to realizations that, she might have certain tendencies. And the psychiatrist also offers perspectives and advice on how she can break those thought patterns or behavioral patterns. For me, I think parts of it helped me reflect on my own life and my own thought processes. And especially because mental health isn't a topic that is so openly talked about in Korea or, even Asia, for that matter, I see how it would give comfort to people who are struggling with depression to know that they're not alone or suffering in silence and that there are other people who are, going through similar things. And the more I think about it, the more respect I have for the author who talks about, mental health and depression so candidly and, sharing her, and she's so brave in sharing her therapy journey. It's really not an easy thing to open up to your friends or to your, to a professional, let alone to the entire world.
Yeah, that actually does sound very progressive and even groundbreaking. And it's not the kind of book that I think you could easily find at that time, in 2018 even. Do you think that played a part in why it became such a big bestseller in Korea?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, right after it was published in the original, right after it was published in 2018, immediately, became a bestseller at Kyobo Bookstore, and which is ranked according to their offline and online sales. Actually, according to a Yonhap news article at the time, 80% of the purchases were by women. And for the whole year of 2018, it ranked number 7 on Kyobo Bookstore's Korean bestseller list.
Wow.
And just to give you some context, Kim Ji-young Born 1982 by Cho Nam-ju was number 4 that year. And it's also one of the books BTS RM has read. So it is a very, very popular book. And I think one of the reasons why it's so popular is because, discussions about mental health are generally considered taboo in Korean society, and even seeking treatment for mental health conditions is largely frowned upon here. And I think a lot of surveys say that people, especially in the older generations, see depression and dealing with mental health as a sign of weakness. And this is despite data showing that there are a significant number of people in Korea who are dealing with depression. So according to data compiled by the National Health Insurance Service, some 681,000 patients were treated for depression in 2017, and of them, 66% were female. And the number of South Koreans treated for depression in 2017 rose 15.8% from 2012. And the suicide rate also remains the highest among OECD countries as of 2020. And Korea has had the highest suicide rate in the OECD every year since 2003, except for 2016 and 2017 when Lithuania topped the list. So for a book like this to lay bare the inner workings and honest feelings of a young working professional, I think was very rare at the time. So I think it became a source of comfort to people to read about it and realize, oh, there's actually other people like me and I'm not alone.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the last 2 years, through the COVID pandemic, we've seen worldwide that mental health has become an issue, public health issue, not just in Korea, but in many countries beyond Asia. And actually, just a little personal side note, my high school friend Lindsay even wrote a memoir about mental health in her family, which I highly recommend. It's called The Woo Woo. And I believe I lent you a copy of it as well. And yeah, it's talking about basically her Chinese Canadian experience of mental health and mental illness going unacknowledged and how that plays out in her life. And as I said, it's a memoir. And this is a friend who grew up in Vancouver, Canada, like me. And so it says something about how these conversations and stigmas around mental health can really follow you anywhere beyond, Korean or Asian context. That being said, do you think the book has helped remove some of the stigma surrounding mental health or brought about any changes here in Korea?
I would like to say that the book is probably one of the first of its kind at the time. And it was actually so popular, the author decided to write a second book that was published the next year. And it follows another 16 weeks of therapy sessions, and it also got made into a play. So you can see how it really took off. And people say the books have really helped spur more realistic portrayals of how people are dealing with depression or other mental health problems in mainstream media. And just to give some examples of how mental health is being portrayed in, TV dramas, Korean series, one example is TVN's Our Blues that aired this year. One of the characters is a divorced mother whose struggling with depression, and she ends up losing custody of her son. And another one a couple years before that, also from TVN, It's Okay to Not Be Okay, which was also very popular. And actually, all three main characters deal with emotional trauma or some mental disorder. So I think, addressing these mental health issues in a more high-profile and open manner is, I think, what's helping more people talk about it, and to help people that maybe they didn't think about seeking treatment before, help them actually think, oh, maybe I do want to go to counseling. Maybe I do want to work on myself.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think that's just the other day we were talking about how our company, Herald Corporation, offers 6 free counseling sessions for employees, right? And so showing that there's even now institutional support at many workplaces for these kind of things. And it's great to see that the book has had such an impact, as you've described. What can you tell us about the author herself, Baek Se-hee, and what motivated her to write this book?
So Baek Se-hee was born in 1990, and she studied creative writing at university, and she worked as a social media editor at a publishing house for 5 years. And I Want to Die, But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki was her first book. In a talk she gave in 2021, Baek Se-hee said the book is not really about conquering or overcoming depression. She says she still deals with it day in, day out. Some days are better than others. But ultimately, the author says it's a long journey of working with these emotions and embracing the dark times as well as the good. So before this book was published, Baek Se-hee said most of the books in this genre were actually written by psychiatrists from their point of view. But this book, it was written by just an ordinary person, somebody who is receiving or who is seeking treatment. So I think this book was really one of the first ones to break that mold. In that same interview, Baek Se-hee said if there was one takeaway from the book, she says she hopes that people won't try to belittle their own feelings of depression and think, oh, everybody goes through their own struggles. Life is supposed to be hard. And she hopes people who read this book feel they're not alone. And, they too can talk about their feelings honestly and openly or write about it. And also at the same time, just learn to slowly fill your own life with things that give you joy and to find their own way of tackling their feelings and depression.
Interesting. And I'm really curious about why the author named this book, I Want to Die, But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki. Can you tell us more about that?
I was also really drawn by the title at first. It's a great title, but I have to warn you, it doesn't actually really talk about tteokbokki. In an interview, she said that she was in a really sort of bad mental state before she went to the hospital to seek treatment, and she had thoughts about ending her own life. But despite going through such a hard time, she still was hungry and she still really had a craving for tteokbokki. And she hated herself for, she hated herself and she felt so much disgust that the tteokbokki she ate at that time tasted so good. So she really struggled with the thought that, wasn't I just thinking of committing suicide just a few minutes ago? How can tteokbokki taste this good? So she really had trouble accepting that she could feel such contradictory feelings. But looking back on that time, she realized that it was natural for you to want to cry one moment and laugh in another, and that it is totally normal for those feelings to coexist. So when she was finally able to acknowledge that and come to peace with her decision and those feelings, she realized that, it's a part of being human. And that's why she decided on the title.
And what aspects, I'm curious to know, of this book did you connect to the most personally?
So each chapter deals with an episode the author goes through or is based loosely around a theme. And it could be fears about her not wanting to burden her colleagues with, feeling sad on the day, or She goes to a movie club and she's worried that people will judge her if she has nothing to say or think that she's, stupid, and look down on her. So out of all these chapters and episode, I think there's really one line that stayed with me the most and I felt like gave me a lot of comfort. It's when the psychiatrist says, "When you're having a hard time, it's natural to feel like you're having the hardest time in the world, and it's not selfish to feel that way." So to me, it was a reminder that you have to be kind to yourself and that people are complicated and you have to give yourself permission to feel the way you feel and not sweep those feelings under the rug because you're feeling shameful or you feel like there are other people who are worse off than you.
Yeah, and that's actually a really powerful message. And I think one that can go way beyond just culture, and it can be a message for anybody, no matter where you're from. Who would you recommend this book to?
So I think this book provides a lot of food for thought, and I can't speak for people who deal with depression, but in some of the reviews I've read, they have said that they feel really seen when reading this book, and they feel like their feelings are validated, and they feel comfort that other people are going through the same thing and it's not just them who are suffering in silence. For others, I think this is a book that will really help you empathize with people who are going through a tough time or they're dealing with depression, and it will help you understand what's really going on underneath the surface, and even though they may look like they're okay on the outside. One thing I would say, though, is that when reading this book, I did feel strange sometimes because you're essentially reading a very detailed account of somebody's actual therapy sessions. And to me, getting counseling is a very private thing. It's, you're in a private space where you can really, private and safe space where you can really talk openly and honestly to your counselor. So just imagining that somebody is sitting there listening to you can feel like, oh, I don't really think I should be here.
Like overly voyeuristic. That's how it felt a little bit.
So, I mean, it is fascinating that you get to see what it's like, but it's also like I can't help but feel that I should really take a step back and that I should leave them space to, yeah. Also, I didn't read this book in one sitting. And I actually think it might be one of those books that you would want to reach for sometimes when you're feeling down. Or I also think it could be something that you can reread again, and that the text will speak to you in a different way, depending on the different mental headspace you're in. So, but to sum it up, I think this book is a chronicle of the author's journey of getting to know herself, her commitment to continue working on herself, and to accept herself as who she is, and that recognizing sometimes even when you feel so devastated that you feel like dying, you also do at the same time want to eat tteokbokki, and that's part of what it means to be human. Beth, I believe that the book you want to talk about today also sheds light on the human condition.
That's right. We're getting really deep in today's episode. The book I'd like to present today is a little bit of a lighter take on what it means to be human, but no less deeper. It's called, as I mentioned before, Inconvenient Convenience Store, 불편한 편의점 by Kim Ho-yeon. As I mentioned, it came out in April 2021. And this was the best-selling book in the first half of the year. And I mean number one for all major online and offline stores here in Korea, including Kyobo, Yangpungmungo, Yes24. It sold over 700,000 copies as of August. Now the sequel, Inconvenient Convenience Store 2, which came out in August of this year, was an immediate bestseller. And at major bookstores, it had an advance print of 100,000 copies, which is quite extraordinary for a book, especially a novel, I would say.
Wow, that sounds like a major achievement. And can you tell us a little bit more about the premise without too many spoilers?
Yes, this is an 8-chapter book in a serial novel format, with each chapter focusing on a different character who takes over the first person narration. So the book begins with two main characters, 70-something-year-old Mrs. Yum, who meets middle-aged homeless man named Toko at Seoul Station. Mrs. Yum has had her purse stolen from her right before she gets on a train to Busan from Seoul. And Toko happens to find it and call her because all of her precious things are in this pouch, her wallet, her bank books, her citizenship card, everything. So she's incredibly relieved and thankful because it's quite rare that, a homeless person would find your things and return them to you. And so Mrs. Yum, who runs a convenience store near the station, ends up offering Toko the overnight shift at her store. And ultimately, so she becomes his employer. And the book then unfolds as Toko encounters various people who are connected to the convenience store or to Mrs. Yum.
And so what was it that made you choose this book?
Well, first of all, for anyone who's been to Korea, and especially Seoul or really any big city, you'll know that convenience stores are like this ubiquitous fixture in almost every neighborhood. Even the most rural areas in Korea have a convenience store, at least one. And I looked it up a little bit about convenience stores. According to figures from 2020, there are over 40,000 convenience stores in Korea with over 190,000 employees. And so I think really, given the sheer number and ubiquity of these places, I think sometimes you can discover the most extraordinary stories from examining ordinary settings or situations really closely. So that was the first appeal of this book. And also, obviously, the runaway success, being number one on the bestseller list for over a year is an incredible feat and made me incredibly curious too, as in, what was all the hype about? Yeah. And finally, just on a personal note, on the actual substantive, content of the book, what I found was that it was this fascinating blend of fairy tale and hyperrealism, in that it's a fairy tale in which the reader must suspend his or her disbelief in a lot of the plot twists, such as a homeless man with alcohol-induced amnesia getting offered a job at a convenience store by this kind-hearted old woman who runs a store simply for her employees' sake. And there's actually a lot of other fairy tale-like twists in the other chapters, but they're kind of counterbalanced with this incredibly realistic dialogue and descriptions of the characters who make incredibly biting and cynical and accurate observations about Korean society. And it really, I think, captures really salient issues in Korean society now, such as culture and communication gaps between generations, which we can see between older and younger characters, such as Mrs. Yum and her daughter. I think it also struck at the growing lack of empathy and communication in Korean society, as they are at the root of many of the characters' problems.
So why do you think that this book was so popular, especially this past year since it was published?
Well, first of all, the book actually takes place in the real world, in real time, as the pandemic begins to unfurl. It references real-life events in the news, such as the February 2020 COVID outbreak among a cult church's members in Daegu, which I think anyone in Korea can remember, and the gradual wearing of masks and use of hand sanitizers that began to become basically a part of our daily lives. It also describes real-life neighborhoods and locales in Seoul, heightening a sense of familiarity for many readers. And I think that the hyper-real setting and characters, in conjunction with the kind of fairy tale elements that I mentioned before, had something to do with the appeal to a lot of people. It was like a nice balance. And many blog reviews in Korean that I read mentioned how easy it was to get totally immersed in these characters and invested in them because they have such intense and yet really relatable situations.
What would you say is the main message or theme, though?
Ultimately, this is a book about how connection and communication can determine one's own happiness. In an interview, the author has said, quote, people are interconnected. I think that if solid individuals help each other, we can live together in an uncomfortable world. Inconvenient Convenience Store is a human drama that tells these stories. So I think this is really what resonated so deeply with readers here. It's really a human story. And I think it also has something to do with the fact that this book came out in the midst of the pandemic, which has so profoundly transformed society over the past 2 years into a far more precarious space, both socially and economically.
That's interesting. Do you think the author thought that it was going to be a bestseller?
Not at all. I mean, in an interview from May, the author, Kim Ho-yeon, was asked why he thought his work was so loved by so many people in Korea. And he said, I thought that the world had just become more harsh. And so it was time for warm comfort. And he said that it's true that I planned and wrote this book with those things in mind. Quote, however, I had no idea that it would be such a beloved work, and I am still puzzled. So, and this is something that I noticed he's repeated in many other interviews. He said that he really did not expect, the runaway, rags to riches success of his work.
Can you tell us more about the author and how he came to write this book?
Yes, and I understand that this might be an author who's not at all familiar with a lot of readers because none of his works have actually been translated into English up to now. Kim Ho-yeon was born in Seoul in 1974. He graduated from Korea University College of Humanities, majoring in Korean language and literature. He worked initially as a screenplay writer for some major production houses and directors for about 14 years before he struck out on his own as a novelist. For Korean readers, he debuted with Mangwon-dong Brothers in 2013, which was a winner of the Segae or World Literature Prize. And he has written a total of 5 novels and a collection of essays over the past 9 years, including the books that we've talked about today. Inconvenience Convenience Store, though, is his first bestseller. According to an interview with YTN Radio earlier this year, Kim has said that he was inspired by a friend who began his own convenience store. And it happened quite spontaneously as he was joking around with his friend, who is not necessarily a very customer-friendly person, about how he runs an inconvenient convenience store. And this catchy phrase was actually inspiration for the title of the book and, became what it is.
So zooming out a bit from the book, can you tell us a little bit about the history of convenience stores in Korea and the role that they play in Korean culture?
Yeah, I found this really fascinating when I was looking into this. Actually, convenience stores only began appearing in Korea in the 1980s. Apparently, Lotte Shopping allegedly opened the first Lotte 7 store in Seoul in 1982, and it was the first convenience store in Korea. They eventually replaced the ubiquitous family or individual-owned corner stores, or in Korean we say 구멍가게, around the country, which had served as local watering holes. These stores were typically small, standalone buildings with a sitting area where people could sit for a few minutes to an hour, a few hours, and catch up on neighborhood gossip or just meet to talk. And the owner would sometimes throw in a couple extra pieces of fruit, like apples or oranges, depending on how friendly you were with them. And though some corner stores do still exist in rural areas, they're basically, relegated as obscure, novelties because, they're just so rare. And they're kind of akin to what, when you find non-ironic VHS or DVD stores.
And it seems that in the past 2 years, especially with the pandemic, that there's been a growing trend or an increase of unmanned retail stores. It's not only convenience stores, it's restaurants, cafes, and even secondhand shops.
Yeah, for sure. Convenience stores were definitely part of this growing industrialization and modernization of Korea. And we can see that speeding up now as a result of the pandemic. And I wonder if one of the reasons this book resonated so much with people was because we saw the pandemic really accelerate these untapped trends and the utilization of AI, making all of us kind of reflect more deeply about what it means to live a meaningful and humane life in a world that is changing so rapidly.
Right, but I actually think that convenience stores today still play a major role in acting as local watering holes for Koreans. In Korean society, I see it in Korean dramas. For example, Squid Game. In, I think, the second episode, you'll see the main character, Lee Jung-jae, played by Lee Jung-jae. He's sitting outside the convenience store and he's drinking soju by himself and, ruminating in his own emotions. And there he meets the old man, or player number one. And stop listening if you haven't watched Squid Game, because I'm going to spoil it right now. But player number one is the creator of the game, and he sits down with him and they have, a heart-to-heart talk. It's just something that is always seen in Korean dramas.
Yeah, that's right. I think anyone who has seen a drama about kind of daily life in the city can really recall some kind of convenience store scene. And again, I think that might be why, this novel has been so popular, because convenience stores have such a mainstream appeal, and it occupies a very, I think, familiar place in a lot of Korean people's minds. I'm curious actually about convenience stores in Hong Kong, because I know you've lived most of your life there, and it's in some ways quite similar and yet very different, in that it's like a very giant Asian metropolis. Do you feel that there are any parallels to Korea in terms of the role that convenience stores play in people's lives?
I mean, it's similar in a sense that you can find one on every other corner in Hong Kong. People go there to pick up, whatever they need. So it is, a convenience store. But I would say it's different in a sense that because Hong Kong's such a small city and land is so scarce that convenience stores are tiny. There's no space or, often tables or chairs inside the store or outside. So you don't really have that culture where in Korea people could, gather there outside for a drink. In Hong Kong, people would still go there to get a beer or alcohol or a drink, but they would have to go away and sit somewhere outside on the curb. So there's not really that luxury of space that we have in Korea or in other places like in Taiwan or Japan, where it's really some of them are being marketed as a space where you can relax and eat a proper meal and charge your phone and do all sorts of things. In Hong Kong, it's really sort of get in, get out.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, while reading this book, I was thinking about Canadian convenience stores. And where I'm from, Vancouver, Canada, they're actually mostly places that you drive or take a really long walk to, because there really aren't that many. We have all the chains. We have 7-Eleven and a few others. I can't really think of anything else except 7-Eleven right now, I think because it was the closest to my neighborhood. But in the suburbs, I think, they're really not necessarily places to just sit and chill and drink with your friends at. The only exception, I think, would be if you're a teenager, like maybe a middle school or high school or even elementary school student. I do remember that there was a bit of a subculture of kids hanging out at convenience stores, just eating junk food and drinking, giant Slurpees. What do you call them? The big gulp.
Were you one of those kids?
No, I was not. I never got an allowance. So I actually, was not part of that subculture, but I do fondly remember that now. Anyways, all this is to say that I think maybe as humans, we're always going to have places where we gather in our neighborhoods where we have some cheap consumable goods and we can just, shoot the shoot the dust, or I don't know what you would say, like just catch up with people. Yeah, and maybe that's something that still reminds us that we are human.
Yeah, and with lunchflation happening, kimbap is probably the best choice right now if you're trying to save money.
Yeah, I do love myself a convenience store lunch. It's the only one that's affordable right now in South Korea.
That's right. So before we sign off, we'd really like to hear what's on your reading list for this fall. And please tweet us your favorites or leave us a comment on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this month's episode, and we hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
My all-time favorite book is called 나의 라임 오렌지나무, which is Mi planta naranja de Lima in Spanish. It's a children's book, but I think that it's a book that can resonate with everyone in different manners throughout your life. It deals with child abuse, classism, poverty, and love within family. And there are many recurring themes that I think would speak to everyone.
저는 언어의 온도라는 책을 추천하고 싶어요. 언어의 온도라는 게 언어를 하면서 사람들이 소통할 때 그 온도가 있으면 정말 따뜻하고 아니면 차갑게 이런 게 느껴진다는 게 신기해요.
저는 버트러트 러셀의 행복의 정복이라는 책을 추천하고 싶습니다.
I recommend Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. This book is about a short history of the whole world, and it provides an explanation of why Europe and America had the fastest development compared to other countries. So it was a very interesting book to me.
저는 메이즈 러너라는 책을 추천하고, 작가 이름은 제임스 대시너라는 분이 저자를 하셨습니다. 그리고 추천하고 싶은 이유는 아마 스토리라인이랑 또 질질 끄는 그런 전개가 없어서 저는 개인적으로 되게 좋았던 책이었던 것 같아요.